I would like to call upon Mr. Zeev Jabotinsky, who is a philosopher and who continues the ways of his grandfather, Zeev Jabotinsky. And Mr. Jabotinsky is going to talk about sovereignty from a legal perspective, that is, from the perspective of international law. Thank you so much, Mr. Zeev Jabotinsky. Good evening. It is an honor for me to talk before you, and the topic that I've chosen to speak about is the topic of who has that right to sovereignty over the state of Israel according to international law. Why did I choose this topic? Because among the secular public, which is the majority in our state, this topic is an extremely important topic because the main justification for this claim for Judea and Samaria to be given to foreign hands is based on international law. And what do they say? They say something that's presumably untrue, and we'll see this in just a moment, that international law says that we have no right for sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. I would like to begin with something controversial. I would like to say, and I claim, that there is no validity to the resolution of the 29th of November. On the 29th of November, you all know, is that founding stone for our independence in its 10th version. That is what? Those who declared independence, they based their right, our right to the state, but they are wrong for the very simple reason that when the UNSCOP committee traveled around Israel and then submitted its proposals to the League of Nations, and there is a convention in that convention of the UN. There is a clause. It's actually clause 80, and it states that we have to change all the regimes of the mandate that were valid when the UN was founded. There were 11 such regimes or administrations, or they're called trusteeships. Until it was done, it was said that nothing can be changed, nothing as far as the rights of nations, of individuals, or of any publics of sorts that live in those territories that were under a mandate under the League of Nations. And the minute that these rights are preserved, they would be preserved until the trusteeship mandate would be changed, or until a state would be founded. The clause is also not valid because, again, in the UN, the Arab states clearly declared that they will impose war against a new state. They tried, but they failed. The recommendation, again, because that the plenary is not just gives proposals to the United Nations, but has no power to pass resolutions. So the establishment of the state relates to a previous proposal according to international law, and it was ratified on the 24th of July 1924 by the League of Nations, and that is the document related to the British Mandate, which is an international contract that all the empires that established the League of Nations, including the United States, are signatories on the documents. The United States was not a member, but it founded the League of Nations. It is founded on a legal principle called the power of disposition, which allows all the empires that won the previous war to redivide the entire territory in order to ensure for themselves quiet for themselves and others, so that such a war would not recur. They did not succeed in fulfilling the objective, but Sir Ian Brownlee, who is again one of the authorities on international law, and he wrote a book which is learned in all faculties all over the world, and he says that this, again, principles that principle was used by the members of the League of Nations, and it was valid. So where does it begin? We have the committee, Peace Committee of 1919 that convened in Paris, and they talked of how to divide the world. The Versailles Agreement was a derivative of this, as well as a division of the Middle East. And since they did not know how to divide up the Middle East, it was first decided to implement another clause of the League of Nations that was formulated during the beginning of that convention, and that was a proposal by who was later war general, who was also again the Prime Minister of South Africa, Jan Smuts, General Jan Smuts, and he proposed the following briefly: to try to reach a situation in which nations, again, that would get their territories would be able to found a state in those territories with a recognition that they had the ability. Until that time, the colonial states would give them help, would mentor them, and would allow them to implement this. And then we have the Paris Peace Convention. They call both sides to convene together. And what do? The first Melech Faisal arrived at the beginning of February 1919. And he sat before the committee. He set forth his claims. And one of the things that he said when he understood that he would not be given to control the entire territories of the Middle East, and by the way, it's the same territory that ISIS dreamt of: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan. And this is what he said in the convention. He said that he's willing to give up his demand for sovereignty over Palestine and Lebanon. Meaning, he said as follows, but he would never give up that demand or them fulfilling the promise about Syria and Iraq. At the end, he didn't get any of these. However, he did waver again on behalf of the Arab nation. He was the representative, and he was said this before the forum that dealt with future agreements. He gave up the demand for sovereignty over Israel. Okay, Israel was, back then, Palestine was Israel and Jordan of today. 3 weeks later, Mr. Chaim Weizmann arrived with a big delegation to that peace convention, and he presented to those coming to the convention a number of demands, the main demand being that he requested the convention recognize the historical connection between the Jewish people and Palestine, and will enable us to found a homeland, a Jewish homeland in this land. And these are the words that he used. We jumping forward to April 1920, those victorious states convened together according to the proposal of that peace convention. And in that convention, they formulate a whole mandate paper for this area, which is called the Mandate for Palestine. It's basically a sort of an international contract signed by all those who were victorious in the war. They all helped formulate it, and this convention fine-tuned the final chapters and the little nuances. We don't have much time, so we can't start discussing the different nuances that were added. However, the most important, point in any contract, whether it's for housing or rent, whatever it is, it's the preamble. And in that preamble, that introduction, the third clause says as follows: we again recognize that historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine, and in its right, we allow them to found their new homeland in this territory. And again, they said this resurrection. That means that they understood that there is already a connection, and we are renewing the right. It's not a new right that we are inventing, and that is a difference between this mandate paper and the other mandates over Syria and Iraq. This document, when one reads it, presents a very clear distinction between civil rights and religious rights of all the residents of the lands, with no difference of origin, and political rights. And it actually gives political rights only to the Jewish people, and says that the representative that is a Zionist movement or the representative of the Jewish people, and also demands the establishment of a Jewish agency, for those who don't know why the Jewish agency was established. And the San Marino Convention in 1920, convened after the Arabs tried to undermine it, through the protests, and they tried to murder Jews. As you well know, there were riots, but there was the League of Defense of Jerusalem that was established by my grandfather, and they were not able to hurt many Jews. They wanted to hurt many, many Jews, hundreds of Jews. Only a few were harmed or hurt. That contract, that mandate, British mandate paper, was ratified 2 years later by the League of Nations. And on the 24th of July 1922, the League of Nations again votes unanimously and in favor and places us into international law. And that is why it is part of international law till this day. Nobody opposed, nobody abstained. Now you say to yourself, the League of Nations went, okay, but the UN came in its stead, and the UN, the first thing was done in 1945. What did they do? They wrote that the UN paper or charter, and the father of that prime minister again dealt with the formulation of that in favor of those events that we are dealing with today. Just take note of that, Mr. Prime Minister. And the UN, in fact, had an opportunity, had this window of opportunity of almost 3 years from that writing of that UN Charter until the establishment of the state, in which he could realize what was written in that chapter of Clause 80 and to change that mandate to a trusteeship. The UN decided not to realize this potential. That was also a statement, and lack of choice is also a statement, and that is why the UN decided not to turn the mandate, to topple it over, and to preserve those principles of the mandate till when? Till 8 hours before the termination of the British mandate. Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the state. He declared 8 hours before the mandate, and not 10 minutes before. And why? Because it was Friday, and he had some partners who would not have liked it, so he declared, he announced that he was establishing the state 8 hours before. So the British had that opportunity, that window of opportunity of 7 hours, and decided not to realize it. They could have said, we are going to delay our departure. We'll go to the UN, we'll change it to a trusteeship, and then we'll take all the rights and we'll change the entire system of rights. The British chose not to do this, and at 12 o'clock they departed. They left Palestine because maybe they miscalculated. Maybe they thought the Arabs would be victorious and it would all end with that war, and it would be the end of the discussion in the matter. But they were wrong, and that is why it was a British choice as well. Furthermore, the United States, again, there's a resolution of the two houses of Congress in the U.S., again, and both sides of the Congress, both parties, resolution 3122 Lodgefish, that basically adopts all the matters that I mentioned before. Again, verbatim, but they basically say that all the rights, civil rights, political rights, national rights would be given to the Jews only. This was submitted to the President of the United States. The minute there is such a resolution from both houses of Congress, it is submitted to the President. He signs it, and that is the law. The law has not been annulled till this day. It might help our Prime Minister, I don't know, but maybe he should take it with him to when he goes to US. The United States is also written on the Anglo-American Convention. It took a long time to ratify it, and the reason why it was even executed was that the United States was not a member in the League of Nations because the Congress and the Senate objected to this, but President Nixon wanted to preserve his rights in Palestine as one of those leading, the empires that led to victory in the First World War, and that is why that Anglo-American Convention was signed. In that convention, it was decided that the whole British mandate, part of it, in any case, that every word written there, including everything that I mentioned, is included in this document as well. And that went to the American Senate, which is that the ratifying body to ratify any international resolution. And the minute it is ratified, it becomes part of the internal law of that state. That is why the UN is actually is obligated twice. Britain once. We say as follows: since the establishment was the state was established 8 hours before the end of the British Mandate, all the rights written there, and the principle is that only the Jews have full right to sovereignty over the entire area. It's all written there. The second thing, it is still part and parcel of international law today. Everything that I mentioned. And Edmund Levy, the committee of Edmund Levy, used different claims. They didn't want to place their hands into the fire. However, what I presented to you is that foundation. I don't have much time. I will tell you one more thing. Everything that I've said has legal groundings from experts, from international law. Jabotinsky, for example, he's not a Jew. He is a resident of Canada. He's a Canadian citizen. He's an expert on civil rights, international law, and he wrote his PhD on this very topic regarding Jerusalem. And his conclusion is that only Jews have a right to sovereignty in Jerusalem. His PhD, by the way, was confirmed and approved by the School for International Law of the Geneva law school. So again, one can assume that they didn't find any flaws in his conclusions, because I imagine that among those, there were people there, I imagine, who understood that these words were true, and Professor Alan Dershowitz words and Professor Irvin Kotler support this as well. Irvin Kotler was the Minister of Law, Minister of Justice in Canada for a number of years. So this is not just hanging in the air. In contrast to the claim that we keep hearing time and time again in Israeli media and international media, that international law says the contrary, but the international law says exactly as I did. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Zeev Jabotinsky.